Hello, everyone. This is a story about how shoes were made before machines existed. Feel free to subscribe to my channel so you can hear from me again. Before we begin, just settle in. Pull your blanket a little closer. Take a slow, quiet breath. There is nothing you need to do right now. Just listen. Somewhere in an old European town, a few hundred years ago, there was a street. It was not a grand street. It was narrow and cobbled, and slightly uneven underfoot. The buildings leaned toward each other at the tops, the way old buildings do, as if they had been slowly nodding off for centuries. On this street, almost every morning, you would hear a particular sound. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, low and steady, coming behind a small window with thick, wavy glass that did not let in much light, the kind of glass that made everything outside look as though it were underwater. Behind that window, a man sat on a low wooden stool. On his lap rested a strange curved iron tool, shaped a little like a foot, but not quite. Beside him, on a worn wooden bench, were rolls of leather, bundles of thread, small pots of paste, and a collection of thin, curved needles that looked far too delicate for the work they had to do. He was a shoemaker. Not the sort of shoemaker from a fairy story, not magical, not mysterious, just a craftsman who had learned his trade as a boy, had worked at it every day since, and who would almost certainly still be at it in 20 years if his hands held out. He had orders to fill. A gentleman on the next street needed a pair of shoes by Thursday. A woman on the far side of town had left a pattern for a soft indoor slipper. A farmer's wife had brought in a boot that needed its sole replaced again. And a small child's shoe sat on the bench waiting to be repaired, its toe worn through from too much running. This was the rhythm of a shoemaker's day. Small, precise, patient work, one shoe at a time, one stitch at a time. Every person in that town was wearing shoes that someone had made like this, by hand, with tools that had barely changed in 200 years, from leather that had been tanned in the yard at the edge of the village, cut on a worn wooden board, and stitched together with thread that was sometimes waxed with beeswax, sometimes with tallow, depending on what was available. Shoes were not a luxury, they were a necessity, but they were also not easy to come by. A good pair of shoes could cost a working person several days' wages. They were repaired rather than replaced, passed down when they still had life in them, worn until they genuinely had nothing left to give. Tonight, we are going to follow the whole story of how shoes were made. From the animal on the field to the leather in the tanner's yard, from the shoemaker's bench to the finished shoe, worn out into the world. It is a quiet story, a careful one, full of small details and patient work. The kind of story that is very easy to listen to with your eyes closed. The tapping continues, soft and steady behind the wavy glass window. Let us begin. Before we can understand how shoes were made, it helps to understand why shoes existed at all. The answer is obvious in one sense. Feet are soft. The ground is not. But it goes a little deeper than that. Human feet are remarkable pieces of engineering. 26 bones, 33 joints, over 100 muscles, tendons, and ligaments, all working together to balance a surprisingly heavy creature on two surprisingly small platforms. They can handle enormous amounts of pressure, absorb shock, adjust to uneven ground, and carry a person many miles across rough terrain. What they cannot do, terribly well, is resist sharp things, or extreme cold, or prolonged wet, or the kind of abrasive friction that comes from walking on stone or gravel or rough ground every day of your life. People figured this out very early. The earliest evidence of foot coverings is difficult to pin down precisely because shoes made of plant fibers or soft animal hide tend not to survive well. But there are indirect clues. Anthropologists studying ancient skeletal remains have found that humans from around 40,000 years ago show a gradual change in the bones of their smaller toes. The smaller toes become slightly less robust over time. This suggests that feet were being wrapped or supported in some way, reducing the work those toes had to do. This lines up with the estimated age of needles found in archaeological sites. If people had needles, they were stitching things, and some of those things were probably for their feet. The oldest actual shoes that have been found are sandals, simple flat soles with straps to hold them in place. Some made from woven plant fibers, some from shaped hide. The oldest confirmed shoe is a piece of leather found in a cave in Armenia, dated to around 5,500 years ago. It was stuffed with grass, probably as insulation. It looks, honestly, not entirely unlike a simple shoe you might still buy today, which says something about how well the basic design worked. Different climates produced different solutions. In warm, dry places like ancient Egypt or the Near East, open sandals made more sense. They let air circulate, they were simple to make, and the ground was usually warm enough that cold was not the main concern. In colder, wetter climates further north, people needed something that enclosed the foot entirely, that kept out the damp, that insulated against frost and snow. For this, leather was the obvious material. It was strong, relatively flexible, could be shaped with heat and water, and, when properly prepared, offered a reasonable degree of water resistance. The shift from sandal to enclosed shoe and from simple plant fiber wrapping to shaped leather footwear happened slowly, over thousands of years, in different places at different paces. By the time of ancient Rome, there was already a remarkable variety of footwear. Sandals for indoors, boots for soldiers, fixed-soled shoes for city streets, special types for different trades and classes. The Romans even had what might be considered the earliest version of a left shoe and a right shoe, something that would disappear and not be properly rediscovered until the 19th century. After Rome, for most of the medieval period, many shoes were made symmetrically, a left and right that were identical, worn alternately so that both shoes wore down evenly. Which sounds strange, but probably you got used to it. The point is, every culture in every part of the world looked down at their feet, looked at the ground, and decided that something needed to go between the two. The question was always just how to make it. The ground is hard, the night is quiet, and somewhere a piece of hide is soaking in a trough, slowly turning into leather.
Everything in this story begins with an animal. Most shoes were made from leather, and leather is, at its core, the preserved skin of an animal. Cattle most commonly, but also sheep, goat, pig, horse, and deer, depending on what was available, what was affordable, and what the finished shoe needed to do. The process of turning raw hide into leather is called tanning, and it is one of the oldest crafts in human history. It is also one of the smelliest. A raw hide, fresh from a slaughtered animal, is soft and wet and perishable. Left alone, it would rot within days. The goal of tanning is to stabilize the hide chemically so that it becomes durable, flexible, and resistant to decay. The traditional method used tannin, a compound found in tree bark. Oak bark was particularly rich in it and was the preferred source in medieval and early modern Europe. Tanneries were usually built beside rivers for a practical reason. The whole process required enormous amounts of water, and the waste it produced needed somewhere to go. The hides arrived at the tannery in a rough state. First, they were soaked in a lime solution for several weeks, which loosened the hair and the outer layer of skin. Then, workers scraped the hides clean on a wooden beam using a curved blade called a fleshing knife, removing any remaining hair, flesh, and fat. This was hard, unpleasant work. The smell was considerable. After scraping, the hides went into a series of pits filled with oak bark solution, each pit slightly stronger than the last. The hides stayed in these pits for months. Thick, heavy hides for boot soles might spend a year or more in the pits. The tannin slowly penetrated the fibers of the skin, binding to the proteins, stabilizing the structure. This slow tanning produced the best leather, firm and dense for soles, flexible and fine for uppers. The finished leather came out a rich brown color, smooth on one side, slightly suede on the other. Tanneries were essential to any community that needed shoes, which was every community, but they were also reliably located outside town or at the downwind edge of it, because the smell of a working tannery was something most people preferred to experience from a significant distance. The people who worked in tanneries were called tanners, and their trade left marks on them. Their hands were hardened and darkened by years of contact with tanning solutions. Their clothes smelled in ways that no amount of washing entirely fixed. They tended to cluster in their own part of town, sometimes their own guild, and they married within their trade more often than most. Once the leather left the tannery, it went to the leather merchant, and from the merchant it found its way to the shoemaker. The shoemaker received it in large sheets. He would inspect it carefully before buying, running a hand across the surface, checking the thickness, bending it to see how it flexed, looking for thin patches, holes left by parasites, or weak spots that might fail under strain. Good leather cost money. You did not want to discover a flaw in it after you had already cut it. The leather sits on the bench, still faintly smelling of the tannery yard. The shoemaker runs a hand across it. It is good leather, dense and smooth. Tomorrow, the cutting begins.
The shoemaker's workshop was a small room, almost always small. Usually the front room of the house, or a separate lean-to building attached to it. A low ceiling with blackened beams, one or two windows that let in just enough light to work by, but never quite enough. A fire in the corner, not for warmth so much as for the small amount of heat that helped with certain stages of the work. The bench was the center of everything. A solid, worn, slightly battered piece of furniture that bore the marks of decades of use. Knife cuts and stitch holes and old patches of wax rubbed into the grain of the wood. The shoemaker sat at it with a kind of bodily familiarity, the way you sit somewhere that has shaped itself to you over many years. Around him, in no particular order, but in the precise order he needed them, were his tools. Knives, several of them, each with a slightly different blade shape suited to a different part of the work. A skiving knife for thinning leather at the edges so that seams would lie flat. A round knife for cutting curved shapes. A straight-bladed trimming knife for the clean edges of soles. Awls. Long, thin spikes of hardened steel used to pierce the leather so that thread could be passed through. The shoemaker had several awls of different gauges. A hole made by an awl was smaller than one made by a drill, and it left the surrounding leather intact. When the thread was pushed through and pulled tight, the leather gripped the thread rather than just sitting around a hole. Thread, made from linen most often, twisted tightly and then waxed with beeswax to stiffen it and make it slide through the holes more easily, and to protect it from moisture once the shoe was finished. The shoemaker twisted his own thread from lengths of linen, using a small technique of rolling it against his knee. It sounds slow because it was. Needles. Curved, very thin, incredibly sharp. Used in pairs for the most important stitching, with a technique that passed one needle through from each side of the leather simultaneously, locking the thread in a way that would not unravel even if the thread were cut. A hammer. For tapping down seams, flattening edges, persuading leather into shape. A last. We will come back to this one. The last was the most important tool in the whole workshop, and it deserves its own chapter. And then there were the smaller things. Wooden pegs for certain types of sole construction, a bone folder for creasing leather to make it bend cleanly along a line, small pots of cobbler's paste and glue, pieces of glass used as scrapers to smooth edges, rasps for shaping the heels. The shoemaker did not buy new tools often. Good tools lasted a lifetime if you cared for them. Some of the tools in a workshop had been there for 2 generations. A grandfather's hand worn smooth by a father's hand, and now the son's hand. The day began early. Light before the fire was lit. Work once the fire was going. The tapping that neighbors heard from outside, the rhythmic, soft sound of a hammer tapping thread into seams or smoothing down an edge, was not loud. It was a domestic sound. The sound of someone at their work. The way a weaver's loom was a domestic sound, or a blacksmith at a distance. A sound that told you the day had started and that things were being made. The workshop smells of leather and wax and wood smoke, and faintly of the tannery on the leather itself. The bench is ready. Let us begin the work. Every shoe ever made by a shoemaker, from the earliest medieval boot to the finest court slipper of the 18th century, was made on a last. The last is the secret of shoemaking, and it is also, in some ways, the whole point of shoemaking. A last is a solid form, roughly shaped like a foot, usually made of wood. Dense, close-grained wood that would not warp or split easily. Beech was popular. So was hornbeam. The last needed to be hard enough to hammer against and stable enough to hold its shape over years of use. The shoemaker built the shoe on the last, around the last, using the last as a mold. The leather was stretched over it and shaped to it, and when the shoe came off the last, it held the form the last had given it. This is why shoes have the shape they have, not because leather naturally falls into that shape, but because a shoemaker stretched it over a carved wooden form and persuaded it to stay there. A shoemaker might own dozens of lasts, each one a slightly different size and shape. Customers with unusual feet, wider, narrower, higher arched, required a last that matched their foot specifically. A well-to-do customer might commission their own personal last, which the shoemaker would keep on a shelf with their name on it and use every time that customer needed new shoes. For most customers, the shoemaker would measure the foot carefully, length, width, the height of the arch, the girth around the instep, then select the closest last from his collection and, if necessary, build it up slightly with layers of leather nailed to the wood until it matched the customer's measurements well enough. This is one reason why handmade shoes, historically, fitted so much better than shoes made any other way. The last was the foot, or very close to it. A good last was also a financial investment. If the last warped or cracked, the shoemaker had to carve a new one or commission one from a last maker, which was itself a separate trade in larger towns. The shape of the last also changed with fashion, and this is where things get interesting and occasionally painful. During the medieval period, shoes often had very long, pointed toes. The longer and more pointed the toe of the shoe, the more fashionable it was considered. At the extreme end of this fashion, in the 14th and 15th centuries, the toes of some shoes extended several inches beyond the actual toes of the foot, supported by stuffing or a wire armature to keep the point from flopping over. These were called poulaines or krakows, and they were genuinely impractical. You could not walk fast in them. You could barely walk comfortably in them. But that, in a way, was part of the point. Only someone who did not need to work, who did not need to move quickly, could afford to wear shoes like that. Later fashions swung in the opposite direction, toward broad, rounded toes, then narrower again, then squared. The last was always shaped to match whatever the prevailing style demanded. A shoemaker who kept up with fashionable lasts stayed in business. One who fell behind found himself making shoes that nobody stylish wanted to be seen in. The last sits on the bench, plain, wooden, slightly scuffed from years of use, shaped like a foot, but not quite a foot. It is the ghost of every shoe that will be made on it.
Once the last was selected and the leather inspected, the shoemaker began to cut. This was one of the most important moments in the entire process and one of the most irreversible. Cut leather incorrectly, and you have wasted material that cost real money. You cannot uncut leather. You cannot stick a piece back on. Every mistake in this stage was a small financial loss, and small financial losses added up. The shoemaker would first make a pattern. This was usually a flat paper or parchment shape, drawn from the measurements of the last, that showed him exactly where to place his knife. Think of it as a map of the shoe laid flat. Different parts of the shoe required different sections of the leather. The upper, the part that wrapped over the top of the foot, needed leather that was fine and flexible. It had to bend with the foot and not crack at the flex points. For this, the shoemaker chose thinner, more pliable leather, often from the hide's belly, where it was naturally softer. The sole, the flat bottom that met the ground, needed to be tough and dense. This came from the thickest part of the hide, usually the back, called the butt. Sole leather was so thick that it was sometimes cut in 2 layers, an inner sole that was lighter and softer against the foot, and an outer sole that was heavy and hard-wearing against the road. The heel needed its own pieces, sometimes built up from several layers of leather stacked and nailed together, sometimes carved from wood and then covered with leather on the outside. The shoemaker laid his pattern on the leather and held it firmly with one hand. With the other hand, he drew the round knife along the edge of the pattern, cutting through the leather in a smooth, confident stroke. Not a sawing motion, a single clean pull. Confident cutting produced clean edges. Hesitant cutting produced ragged ones, and ragged edges were harder to stitch and finish neatly. He would nest the shapes together on the leather, like pieces of a puzzle, to avoid wasting material between them. Every offcut was saved. Small pieces could be used for heel stiffeners, called counters, at the back of the shoe. Smaller pieces still could be used for lining or sold to other tradespeople. Nothing useful was discarded. Different leathers were cut differently. Soft kid leather for fine shoes required the lightest possible pressure and the sharpest possible blade. Thick sole leather sometimes needed several passes of the knife, working deeper each time. A skilled shoemaker could cut all the pieces for a pair of shoes in an hour or 2. A less experienced one might take a full morning and be less happy with the result. Once all the pieces were cut and checked, they were laid out on the bench in order. The 2 uppers, the 2 insoles, the 2 outer soles, the heel pieces, small stiffeners for the toe and the back, thin strips of leather that would be folded and stitched to reinforce the seams. They did not look like much yet, just flat pieces of brown leather on a wooden bench, but they were already, in the shoemaker's mind, a pair of shoes. The pieces are cut. The knife rests on the bench. The fire ticks quietly in the corner. The real work is just beginning. Now comes the stage the shoemaker had been building toward since the first cut, the lasting. This is the process of stretching the upper over the last and fixing it in place so that it holds the shape of the shoe. It sounds simple. It is not simple. First, the insole was tacked to the bottom of the last. Just a few small nails to hold it flat against the wooden sole of the form. This gave the shoemaker something to work against when he pulled the upper down and over. Then the upper was dampened slightly. Not soaked, just enough moisture to make the leather a little more cooperative. Leather, when damp, becomes temporarily more pliable. It can be stretched and persuaded into curves and shapes that dry leather would resist. The shoemaker placed the upper over the last, positioning it carefully. The leather needed to sit symmetrically. The toe needed to land in the right position. The back seam, if there was one, needed to be centered. Then he began to pull. Using a specialized pair of pliers called lasting pincers, he gripped the leather at the toe, pulled it firmly down and over the edge of the insole, and hammered a tack through it to hold it there. Then the heel.
Then the sides, working around the last, pulling the leather taut and hammering it down at intervals. The leather resisted. Leather always resists. It does not want to be pulled and shaped. The shoemaker pulled harder. The pincers left marks. The tacks held. The toe area was the most difficult. The leather had to be eased around the curve of the toe without bunching or wrinkling. A skilled shoemaker could pleat and smooth the excess leather so that the finished surface at the toe was clean and tight. A less skilled one left small wrinkles that would show in the finished shoe and never fully go away. As the leather dried on the last, it stiffened. It took on the shape it had been given, the curve of the arch, the width at the ball of the foot, the lift at the heel. All of it set into the leather as it dried, the way a plaster cast sets around its mold. Small wooden pegs or additional tacks held everything in place until drying was complete. The whole workshop, on a lasting day, smelled of damp leather and beeswax. Once the upper was dried and set, the shoemaker could begin stitching the upper to the insole. This was done through a narrow strip of leather called a welt, which was stitched to the upper's edge first and then to the insole through a channel cut in the insole's surface. This is called welt construction, or Goodyear welt. Though before Charles Goodyear mechanized the process, it was simply called the standard method, done entirely by hand. The stitches had to be tight, regular, and deep enough to hold without punching through the full thickness of the insole. They were sewn with the locking two-needle stitch, one needle through from the inside, one from the outside, the threads crossing inside the leather itself. It was slow, patient, rhythmic. Stitch after stitch after stitch. The last is still inside the shoe. The upper is pulled tight around it, drying and stiffening, taking on the shape it will keep for the rest of its life. Everything so far has been preparation. The sole is next.
Of all the stages of making a shoe, stitching the sole was the most demanding. Not the most creative, not the most skilled in terms of judgment, but the most physically demanding on the hands and the most relentless in terms of the sheer number of stitches required. The outer sole was thick, dense, tanned to resist everything the ground would throw at it. Pushing a needle through it was hard. Doing it hundreds of times in a row with consistent depth and spacing was harder. The technique used for stitching the sole differed slightly from the technique used for the upper. The upper was stitched through relatively thin, flexible leather. You could use curved needles and linen thread, pulling through with steady force. The sole required a different approach. A channel was cut along the inner edge of the outer sole, a thin groove like a shallow trench in the leather, and the stitching was done into this channel so that the threads sat slightly below the surface of the sole. This protected the thread from wear. Every time you walked on a stitched sole, the thread would otherwise be the first thing to meet the ground. By recessing it into a channel, the leather itself took the wear and the thread was shielded underneath. To punch through thick sole leather, the shoemaker used a heavy awl with a wider blade than the ones used for the upper. He pushed it through with considerable force, sometimes with the palm of his hand, sometimes with a wooden pusher, sometimes with the heel of his hand. After each hole, he passed two threads through simultaneously, one from each side, crossing them inside the leather in the same locking stitch used elsewhere. He worked his way around the entire perimeter of the sole, around the toe, along the sides, around the heel. Hundreds of stitches, pulled tight at each one so the sole sat flat and firm against the welt. When the stitching was done, the channel was closed. The groove that had protected the thread during sewing was hammered shut, pressing the surrounding leather back down over the thread so that the surface appeared smooth. Then the edge of the sole was trimmed. Any leather that extended beyond the edge of the upper was cut cleanly with a knife, and then the edge was worked with a file and a piece of glass until it was smooth and even. The raw edge of leather was rounded and smoothed, sometimes darkened with ink or wax. The heel was added last, built up from layers of leather,
each layer hammered flat, the whole assembly nailed through the sole and into the last from below. The outside of the heel was trimmed and shaped so that it was square and true, or rounded at the back as the style required. A thin iron or leather patch was sometimes nailed to the very bottom of the heel seat, to protect it from the specific kind of wear that came from how most people walked, striking the ground heel first. When all the stitching was done and all the edges were finished, the shoemaker removed the tacks that had been holding the upper to the last, reached inside the shoe, and carefully worked it free of the last by pulling and easing and sometimes bending the shoe gently until the wooden form could be withdrawn. The shoe, for the first time, was empty. It held its shape without the last inside it. That was the whole point. That was everything all the lasting and stretching and drying had been for. The shoe sits on the bench, complete in form, still a little stiff, still smelling faintly of damp leather and beeswax. One more stage, and it will be finished. Once the sole was stitched and the last removed, the shoe needed to be finished. Finishing is the difference between something that works and something that is pleasant. The shoe was already structurally complete at this point. It would keep the rain out, it would last through months of wear, it would protect the foot. But it was also slightly roughed around the edges, slightly pale where the leather had not yet been treated, and slightly stiff in a way that would soften with wear, but was still noticeable to the hand. The first thing the shoemaker did was to inspect the shoe closely for any imperfections, uneven stitches, a small wrinkle in the upper that had escaped notice during lasting, a rough patch on the insole edge. These were addressed now while the shoe was still workable. The edge of the sole was worked again with a rounded wooden tool called a bone folder, or sometimes a smooth piece of adler, heated slightly over the fire. The heat compressed the fibers of the leather at the edge, smoothing and glazing them. The result was an edge that looked clean and professional and felt smooth to the touch rather than raw and fibrous. The outside of the shoe, the upper, was treated with various substances depending on what the customer expected and what was available. Tallow, which is rendered animal fat, was rubbed into the leather and worked in with a cloth. It softened the leather and gave some degree of water resistance. Beeswax was used similarly. For finer shoes, more refined preparations were used, combinations of wax, oil, and sometimes lamp black, fine carbon soot, which darkened the leather and gave a subtle shine. For very fine shoes, the upper might be burnished. A smooth polishing tool was worked back and forth across the surface of the leather with moderate pressure. Done slowly and repeatedly, this produced a faint but genuine shine, the leather fibers compressed and aligned by the friction. The inside of the shoe received attention too. The insole surface was smoothed. Sometimes a thin leather sock was glued inside to give the foot a softer contact point. The upper, where it folded over the top edge and touched the ankle and foot, was checked for rough spots that might rub. Throughout all of this, the shoemaker was imagining the customer, the person who would put this shoe on, who would walk in it, who would wear it until it wore out and bring it back for repair. A good shoemaker took a kind of quiet pride in this work that is hard to describe briefly. It was not pride in a showy sense, it was more like the satisfaction of having done something correctly. Every stage of the shoe connected to every other stage. The quality of the leather affected the quality of the cutting. The quality of the cutting affected the lasting. The lasting affected the stitching. The stitching affected everything the customer would experience when they put the shoe on. A badly made shoe at any stage could not be fully saved by good work at the next. A well-made shoe from beginning to end held together in a way you could feel when you put it on, even without knowing why. The finished shoes were set on a shelf to air, side by side, smelling of wax and leather and a very faint trace of the smoky workshop, waiting for the customer to collect them. The fire ticks quietly. The shelf holds 2 new shoes, still and finished. The shoemaker picks up the next piece of leather. There is always another pair to begin. Here is something worth knowing because it trips people up. In the old trade, a shoemaker and a cobbler were not the same thing.
They were different jobs with different skills, different tools, and, in many towns, different guilds. A cordwainer made new shoes. The word comes from cordovan, which is a type of fine leather that originally came from the city of Cordoba in Spain. Cordovan leather was prized for its quality, and the craftsmen who worked with it became known as cordwainers. The name stuck even as the leather they used broadened out to include all fine leathers. A cobbler repaired shoes. This sounds like a small distinction. It was not a small distinction. In medieval towns, the guilds enforced this boundary firmly. A cordwainer who did too much repair work was treading on the cobbler's territory. A cobbler who tried to make new shoes from scratch was encroaching on the cordwainers. These boundaries were taken seriously, and violations of them led to genuine disputes, fines, and legal complaints. The cobbler's work was, in some ways, as skilled as the cordwainers. Repairing a shoe well required understanding how it had been made. You had to unpick the stitching without damaging the surrounding leather. You had to replace a worn sole without distorting the upper. You had to patch a crack or a hole so that the patch held without creating a new weak point nearby. A cobbler who did this badly left a shoe worse than before. A cobbler who did it well could extend the life of a shoe by years. And shoes needed extending, because new shoes cost a great deal and most people did not buy them often. A working person in medieval England might expect to own 1 or 2 pairs of shoes at a time. 1 pair for everyday use, possibly 1 smarter pair for church or market days. Both pairs would be worn until they genuinely could not be repaired further. The uppers might outlast 3 or 4 sets of soles. The sole might be replaced and the heel rebuilt multiple times before the upper finally gave out. This was not unusual or unfortunate. It was simply how things were. Shoes were made to be repaired and repaired again, and the people who made them understood that. The cobbler's bench, like the cordwainers, was a permanent fixture of the neighborhood. You knew where your cobbler was. You left shoes with him before winter and picked them up resoled for the cold month. You brought him the child's boot that had split along the seam. You brought him your good church shoes when the heel began to rock. He knew his customer's feet without being told. The lady on the corner walked with her weight on the outside edge, so her heels wore down that way. The farmer from the edge of town was hard on his soles. The schoolmaster's shoes were always well kept, but needed new heels every 6 months. This was not information written down anywhere. It was simply known. Carried in the hands and the memory of a man who had been fixing the same neighborhood's shoes for 30 years. The cobbler taps quietly on the bench. A worn boot sits before him, upright and patient, waiting to be made useful again. Outside, the street is quiet. Inside, the work goes on. Not all shoes were made equal. In any given town, there was a shoemaker for the ordinary work, and in larger towns, a shoemaker whose trade was the upper end, whose customers arrived at the workshop rather than sending a servant, who kept a waiting list, who had lasts for the same families going back 2 or 3 generations. For wealthy customers, shoes were not just functional objects. They were, in a modest way, a statement. The materials were different. Where a working person's shoe used standard tanned cattle hide, a wealthy person's shoe might use fine calf leather, which was more supple and took a better surface, or kid leather from young goats, which was softer still and very smooth to the touch, or cordovan leather imported from Spain, which was famous for its strength and its ability to take a high polish. The linings were different too. Ordinary shoes might have no lining at all, or a rough linen sock. Fine shoes were lined with soft kid leather, or with silk in the most luxurious examples.
The colors were different. Most everyday shoes were brown, because brown was what tanned leather naturally came to. Wealthy shoes were colored. Black, which required special finishing processes. White or cream for certain formal occasions. In some periods, red was fashionable. In others, bright colors were associated with specific social ranks. The construction was different too. A fine shoe was sewn with smaller, tighter, more numerous stitches. The edges were finished more carefully. The shape was more precisely fitted to the customer's foot, using a last that had been built specifically to their measurements. The toe might have a particular shape that the customer had requested. The heel might be built to a specific height. And the decoration was different. Fine shoes were sometimes decorated in ways that plain shoes were not. Pinking, a pattern of small cuts or holes punched through the upper leather, was a popular decorative technique that added pattern to the surface without requiring embroidery. Slashing was another technique, where the outer layer of leather was cut in regular slashes to reveal a colored lining beneath. Embroidery appeared on the finest shoes. Silk thread worked in patterns across the toe or vamp of the shoe. Some surviving examples in museum collections are extraordinarily detailed. Flowers and geometric patterns worked in gold thread over leather that has been dyed deep red or black. Buckles arrived in the 17th century and became one of the most visible signs of a shoe's status. A large, ornate silver or silver plate buckle on the front of a shoe was expensive, eye-catching, and unmistakably fashionable. The buckle became so important that shoes were sometimes designed with the buckle as the centerpiece, the leather almost secondary. A wealthy customer commissioning shoes expected to wait. A custom pair of fine shoes took longer than a standard pair, obviously. But there was also a social dimension to the waiting. You sent a measuring foot, a paper or thin board cut to the outline of your foot, and the shoemaker would write to you when the shoes were ready. The exchange was a transaction between people of a certain standing. And when the shoes were collected and taken home and put on for the first time, the experience was different from putting on ordinary shoes. They were softer immediately, shaped more precisely, finished more smoothly. They creaked in a particular way that new fine leather creaks, a small and satisfying sound. The wealthy person who wore them probably did not think much about the weeks of patient work that had gone into them. Most people do not think about that. But the shoemaker knew. For most people, the shoe was a much simpler thing. Not necessarily an ugly thing or a badly made thing. Shoemakers took a professional pride in their work, even for ordinary customers, but a simple thing, practical, made to last, made to be repaired, made without decoration or expensive materials or fitted lasts. A poor man's shoe in the medieval period was often made from cattle hide in its most basic form. Thick where it needed thickness, thin where it needed flexibility. Sewn with sturdy linen thread, resold once, twice, 3 times as the years went on, worn every day in all weathers until it was truly finished. In many parts of Europe, the very poorest people wore wooden shoes, clogs. The clog gets dismissed sometimes as a joke or a curiosity, a Dutch tourist attraction, a prop in a folk dance. In reality, the wooden clog was an excellent piece of practical footwear for its intended purpose. It was made from a single block of wood. Willow, alder, or poplar were popular, being soft enough to carve and light enough to wear. The clogger, who was a separate trade from the shoemaker, used a series of specialized hooked blades to hollow out the inside of the block into the shape of a foot. The outside was shaped and smoothed. The result was a shoe that was waterproof by nature — wood does not let water through the way leather does — durable, cheap, and replaceable. For someone who worked in wet conditions, in the fields or the tannery or the fish market or the low-lying farmlands of the Netherlands or northern France, the wooden clog was not a poor substitute for a real shoe, it was the right shoe for the job. In England, clogs were common in industrial areas and among working people in the north for centuries. A clog with a leather upper over a wooden sole, combining the best of both materials, was particularly practical, and this style persisted well into the 19th century. For children, shoes presented a particular challenge. Children grew, shoes did not. A child who outgrew a pair of shoes faster than the family could afford to replace them wore shoes that were too small, or shoes that were too large and stuffed with rags, or no shoes at all in summer. Hand-me-downs were universal. A child's shoes passed to a younger sibling when they no longer fit, repaired as needed, resoled when the sole wore out. Children who grew up in large families often wore shoes that bore the marks of 2 or 3 previous wearers. For many children, especially in the summer months, shoes were simply not worn. Bare feet in warm weather were normal and practical. The skin of the soles would harden over weeks of walking on rough ground until the child could cross a cobbled street without discomfort. Shoes were put on for church, for market days, for important occasions. Otherwise, they were taken off and put somewhere safe because they cost money and they needed to last. A pair of shoes sitting by the door, saved for Sunday. A child's feet on a stone floor, hard and capable and unconcerned. The fire in the hearth burns low. The room is quiet. Outside, the lane is muddy after the rain. Morning will come soon enough. Shoes were not all the same shape for all the same purposes. Different kinds of work, different kinds of terrain, and different social roles all produced different kinds of footwear, and shoemakers made all of them. The boot was one of the most important variations. Where a shoe covered only the foot and stopped at the ankle, a boot extended upward. A short boot might reach mid-calf. A long boot, a riding boot, might reach the knee or higher. Boots offered obvious advantages in certain situations. They kept mud from going over the top of the shoe in wet fields. They protected the lower leg in dense undergrowth. They kept out the cold in winter. And for riding on horseback, they were almost essential, both for the grip they gave in the stirrup and the protection they offered against the horse's sides and any brush the rider moved through. Riding boots were one of the most specialized types of shoe that a shoemaker might be asked to make. They required very different construction from a walking shoe. The leg needed to be stiff enough to support itself upright, which meant heavy, firm leather, often without much internal structure, relying on the density of the leather itself. The toe and sole needed to be sturdy enough to take the pressure of a stirrup. The boot needed to slide on and off the foot fairly easily, which affected how the leg was shaped at the top. Getting all of this right required real skill, and a shoemaker who was known for good riding boots had a particular kind of customer. At the other end of the practical spectrum were indoor shoes and slippers. Where outdoor shoes needed thick soles and sturdy construction, indoor shoes could afford to be lighter and softer. A slipper might have a sole barely thicker than the upper leather, soft enough to feel through with the sole of the foot. These were worn inside the house, on stone or wood floors, by people who preferred not to wear outdoor shoes indoors. The pattens deserve a mention here. A patten was not a shoe, it was something worn over a shoe. It was a flat wooden platform, roughly the shape of a sole, raised up on an iron ring or wooden stilts that the wearer strapped over their regular shoe before stepping outside into muddy or wet streets. By elevating the real shoe a few inches above the ground, the patten kept the good leather shoe clean and dry. The sound of pattens on cobbled streets was its own distinctive urban sound in medieval and early modern towns, a kind of wooden clacking. You could hear someone in pattens from some distance away, which was probably useful. Pattens were worn by both men and women, but more commonly by women, whose longer skirts would otherwise have collected an impressive amount of mud from the streets. In some towns, bylaws eventually restricted the wearing of pattens indoors because the iron rings on the underside scratched and damaged floor surfaces, which suggests that some people were extremely reluctant to remove them when coming inside. Fashionable shoes changed over time in ways that sometimes made no practical sense at all, and were probably not meant to. Chopins, platform shoes popular in Renaissance Italy and Spain, raised the wearer on soles that could be several inches to over a foot high. They required an attendant to walk in safely. They were not for walking distances. They were for being seen indoors, elevated and impossible to ignore. The shoe was many things at once: a tool, a status signal, a comfort, a necessity. Always made by hand, always one stitch at a time. The boot stands by the door, muddy at the sole, the leather worn to the shape of the foot that has lived in it for a year. Outside, the lane winds on toward the fields. In larger towns and cities, the shoemaking trade was organized by a guild. Guilds were the professional organizations of the medieval and early modern world. Every significant trade had one. Bakers had their guild, weavers had theirs, goldsmiths, carpenters, tailors, all organized, regulated, and largely governed by guilds. The cordwainers' guild controlled who could make shoes in a town, how they could make them, and what standards the shoes had to meet. To become a shoemaker, you did not simply decide to become one. You began as an apprentice, usually between the ages of 12 and 14, bound by a legal contract to a master shoemaker for a term of years. 7 years was typical in England. During that time, you lived in the master's household, worked in his workshop, and received no wages, only your food, lodging, and clothing, and the education in the trade. In those 7 years, you learned everything: how to recognize good leather and bad leather, how to cut efficiently, how to last a shoe, how to stitch the sole, how to repair a boot without making it worse, how to talk to customers, how to manage the materials so that waste was minimal. At the end of your apprenticeship, you became a journeyman. A journeyman was a qualified craftsman who had completed his apprenticeship but had not yet established his own workshop. The name comes from the French word for day, because a journeyman was paid by the day. Some journeymen worked in the same workshop where they had apprenticed. Others moved around, working for different masters in different towns, gaining experience and saving money toward the goal of setting up their own business. To become a master, to have your own workshop, to take on your own apprentices, to be a full member of the guild, you had to produce a masterpiece. Not a masterpiece in the modern sense of a great work of art, simply a piece of work, made to the guild's standards, demonstrating that your skills were sufficient to be trusted with the trade's reputation. If the guild judged your masterpiece acceptable, you were admitted as a master. If they did not, you were sent back to work as a journeyman and told to try again. The guild maintained quality. It inspected finished shoes. It prosecuted members who used poor materials or cut corners. It set the prices that masters could charge to prevent undercutting that would harm everyone. It controlled the number of apprentices a master could take to prevent the market from being flooded with half-trained workers. It also controlled entry from outside. A shoemaker from another town could not simply set up shop in your town without the guild's permission. This protected existing members from competition, which was partly fair and partly not. But it also gave the trade a stability. A shoemaker with a guild behind him was a craftsman of recognized standing. When a customer brought a commission to a guild master, they were dealing with someone whose skills had been verified, whose reputation was tied to the guild, and who could be held accountable if the work was poor. The guild hall was often the grandest building the trade possessed, used for meetings, for feast days, for the formal admission of new masters, for the settling of disputes, and once a year, sometimes more, for the kind of dinner that a guild of tradespeople could put on when they put their minds to it, which, by all accounts, was rather good. The guild hall is quiet now at this hour. The doors are closed. The evening is settling in. Tomorrow, the workshops will open again.
Not every pair of shoes was made to order. By the later medieval period, in larger towns and cities, some shoemakers were producing shoes to sell directly from a market stall, rather than waiting for individual commissions. This required making shoes in standard sizes, which sounds obvious and modern, but was, at the time, a relatively new development. The concept of standardized shoe sizes was emerging slowly, and it was far from universal or precise. A shoemaker making shoes for market might produce a range of sizes based on common foot dimensions he had observed over years of measuring customers. The sizes were rough by modern standards. There was no internationally agreed numbering system. A size in one town might mean something different in the next. But it worked well enough. A person could go to a market stall, try on a shoe, judge whether it was close enough to their foot, and buy it if it was. The fit would not be as good as a custom-made shoe, but it was faster and cheaper, and for many people, faster and cheaper was what mattered. Shoe markets existed in most towns by the 14th and 15th centuries, a dedicated street, sometimes called Shoemakers' Row or Cordwainer Street, where multiple shoemakers had their shops and stalls side by side. Customers could move along the street, comparing prices and quality, something that would have been much harder when each shoemaker worked only by commission. The stalls displayed finished shoes, hanging from hooks above the stall, arranged on boards below the counter. The shoemaker or his apprentice stood at the front, calling out to passers-by or simply waiting for someone to stop and look. Bargaining was normal. The price on a market stall was not necessarily the final price. A customer who expressed doubt or turned to look at the stall next door might find the price suddenly becoming more negotiable. Seasonal patterns shaped the market. Before winter, there was demand for boots and heavier shoes. Before important feast days and holy days, people wanted better shoes for church. Fairs brought extra customers from the surrounding countryside who might not visit town often and who might need to buy several things, including shoes, before returning home. A shoemaker at market also did small repairs on the spot, reattaching a loose sole, replacing a broken strap, punching a new hole in a belt. These small jobs brought in cash quickly and attracted customers who might stay to buy something larger. The apprentice's job at the market stall was to keep the stock organized, to hand things to the master to show customers, to run back to the workshop if something specific was needed, and to watch the stock carefully when the master was occupied, because shoes left unattended could disappear if the wrong sort of person walked by. The market was noisy. The street smelled of leather and horse and food from nearby stalls. And in the middle of all of it, the shoemaker stood at his stall, judging a customer's foot with one glance, reaching for the right shoe without looking, and talking, always talking, while his hands were busy with something else entirely. The market begins to empty as evening comes. The stalls are covered over for the night. The unsold shoes are gathered up and taken back to the workshop. Tomorrow, the stall will open again.
For most of human history, everything we have described in this story was simply how it was done. Not a craft, not a heritage skill, not something unusual, just how shoes were made. By hand, in small workshops, by people who had learned the trade as children and who would pass it on to the next generation. And then, as with wool and cloth and so many other trades, something changed. It changed slowly at first, and then very quickly. The first major shift was the invention of a machine that could produce the welt stitch, the key stitch that held upper to sole in good quality shoe construction, mechanically. Charles Goodyear Jr., son of the man who vulcanized rubber, patented the Goodyear welt machine in the 1870s. In one operation, it could perform stitching that a skilled hand sewer would take many minutes to complete. Other machines followed. Machines for cutting leather to precise patterns, machines for lasting the upper over the last using mechanical grippers rather than human hands and pincers, machines for nailing the sole, machines for trimming and finishing the edges. By the 1880s and 1890s, large shoe factories in places like Northampton in England and Brockton in Massachusetts in the United States were producing shoes in quantities that would have been unimaginable to the craftsmen who had come before them. Thousands of pairs per day in standardized sizes at prices that even working people could afford. This changed everything. The number of hand shoemakers declined rapidly. The guild system that had governed the trade for centuries became irrelevant. Young people who might once have apprenticed to a cordwainer went to work in factories instead, tending machines that did in seconds what their grandfathers had spent hours doing by hand. Shoes became cheap enough that repair was less necessary. You could buy a new pair, and then another. The cobbler's trade survived, but it contracted. The shoe became ordinary in a way it had never quite been before. Not a significant purchase, not something repaired carefully and passed down, just a thing you bought when the last pair wore out, or when you wanted a different style, or simply when you felt like it. Which, in material terms, was progress. People who had gone barefoot in summer because shoes were too expensive could now afford shoes. Children who had worn shoes 2 sizes too small could have shoes that fitted properly. This matters. But something was also lost. Not the difficulty. Nobody misses difficult work for its own sake, but the relationship between the person and the object, between the maker and the customer, between the foot and the shoe that was shaped to it. A shoemaker who knew your foot did not need to be told that you walked on the outside edge, or that your left foot was slightly wider than your right, or that you needed the toe box a little deeper than standard because of how your toes sat. He knew. He had known for years. The last with your name on it was on the shelf. That relationship is gone now. Not mourned much by most people, but gone. The old workshops are mostly gone too. A few remain, in the way that a few windmills remain and a few blacksmiths' forges remain. People who love the work, who learned it from someone who loved the work, keeping something alive because some things deserve to be kept. In those workshops, the sound is still the same, soft and rhythmic. The owl pushing through leather, the thread pulled tight, the hammer tapping a seam flat. The same sound that came through the wavy glass window on the cobbled street all those years ago. The fire is very low now. The workshop is quiet. The shoes on the shelf are still. Let your breathing slow down. Let the images drift gently away. The leather on the bench, the last on the shelf, the needle and thread, and the long, patient work. All of it quiet now, all of it still. Sleep well.